The year was 1817, and England stood at the pinnacle of its social refinement, a nation where every gesture, every glance, every breath was dictated by an invisible yet impenetrable hierarchy that governed the lives of all who dwelt within its borders. The Regency era had established a society so rigidly structured that one's birth determined not merely their position, but their very essence, their worth, their right to exist in the world of privilege and power. London's Mayfair district gleamed like a jewel in the crown of aristocracy, its Georgian mansions rising like marble monuments to centuries of bloodline supremacy. Behind ornate iron gates and manicured gardens, the noble families of England lived in a world apart, where servants moved like shadows and the lower classes existed solely to serve the whims of their betters. Ravenshollow Estate, seat of the Earl of Blackwood, stood as perhaps the most magnificent example of aristocratic grandeur in all of England. The imposing structure, built of honey-colored Cotswold stone, stretched across acres of perfectly manicured grounds, its neoclassical facade adorned with Corinthian columns that reached toward the heavens like fingers grasping for divine approval. Generations of earls had walked these halls, their portraits lining the grand corridors in an endless parade of powdered wigs, silk waistcoats, and expressions of cold nobility. Within these walls, a small army of servants moved with practiced precision, their lives governed by bells that summoned them to duty at all hours of the day and night. The hierarchy below stairs mirrored that above, with the butler reigning supreme, followed by the housekeeper, the ladies' maids, the footmen, the kitchen staff, and finally, at the very bottom of this carefully constructed pyramid, the housemaids who scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots with hands red and raw from constant labor. The servants' quarters occupied the uppermost floors of the estate, cramped rooms tucked beneath the eaves where narrow windows offered glimpses of a world they could observe but never enter. Here, in these austere chambers furnished with little more than a cot, a wash-basin, and perhaps a small mirror cracked with age, lived those whose labor sustained the luxury of their masters. They rose before dawn and retired long after the family had taken their leisure, their days measured not in hours but in tasks completed, orders followed, and mistakes avoided. The rigid protocols of service had been refined over centuries into an art form of invisibility. A proper servant was seen only when needed, heard only when spoken to, and noticed only when absent. They glided through the grand rooms like ghosts, dusting priceless porcelain, polishing silver that gleamed like captured moonlight, and maintaining the illusion that wealth and privilege existed effortlessly, without the constant toil of human hands. In the kitchens below, copper pots bubbled over open fires as cook prepared elaborate meals that would grace the dining room table upstairs. The scullery maids scrubbed mountains of dishes in scalding water, their fingers pricked by broken china and scalded by steam. The air hung thick with the aroma of roasting meats, fresh bread, and delicate pastries that would delight the palates of the noble family while the servants sustained themselves on simple fare and grateful exhaustion. The social season of 1817 promised to be particularly splendid, with whispers of magnificent balls, elaborate dinner parties, and perhaps most exciting of all, the potential for advantageous marriages that could further elevate the already exalted status of England's premier families. Young ladies of good breeding would be presented at court, their futures determined by the size of their dowries and the blueness of their blood, while gentlemen of noble birth would survey the marriage market with the calculating gaze of men purchasing prize livestock. Against this backdrop of glittering privilege and hidden suffering, strict moral codes governed every aspect of aristocratic life. Reputation was a currency more valuable than gold, and scandal could destroy generations of carefully cultivated status with the swiftness of a sword stroke. Ladies were expected to be paragons of virtue, their every move chaperoned and monitored, while gentlemen enjoyed considerably more freedom but were still bound by the unwritten laws of honor and duty to their family names. The Church of England provided the moral framework that justified this rigid hierarchy, preaching that God himself had ordained the natural order of society, that the poor should be grateful for their lowly stations and the rich should bear their burdens of wealth with Christian grace. Sunday services in the estate's private chapel reinforced these divine truths, with the family occupying ornate pews at the front while servants crowded together in the back, their prayers perhaps more fervent for their recognition of their place in both earthly and heavenly kingdoms. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the servants' corridors of Ravenshollow Estate with the quiet efficiency that had kept her employed for 3 years in one of England's most demanding households. At 22, she possessed a beauty that transcended her humble station, though she took great pains to conceal it beneath modest dress and restrained demeanor. Her chestnut hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, her grey servant's dress carefully mended but spotlessly clean, and her green eyes kept carefully downcast in the presence of her superiors. Born in a small village in Yorkshire, Eleanor had come to London after her father's death left her family destitute. Her mother, once a lady's maid herself, had secured Eleanor's position through connections made during her own years of service. The transition from village life to the grand estate had been jarring, but Eleanor had adapted with the resilience of one who understood that survival often depended on one's ability to become invisible. Her days began at 5 in the morning when the first bell summoned the housemaids to their duties. While the household slept, Eleanor would light fires in the main rooms, dust furniture that gleamed with generations of careful polishing, and prepare the morning rooms for the family's eventual awakening. She moved through these tasks with practiced grace, her movements economical and precise, never disturbing the perfect arrangement of objects that spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries. Mrs. Pemberton, the stern housekeeper who ruled the female staff with an iron fist encased in a velvet glove of maternal concern, had taken a particular interest in Eleanor's development. The older woman, herself a product of the servant class who had risen through decades of faithful service, recognized in Eleanor a refinement that suggested better breeding than her current circumstances might indicate. "Remember, girl," Mrs. Pemberton would say during their weekly reviews, "a good servant anticipates needs before they are spoken. We are here to make the lives of our betters flow smoothly, to ensure that their world remains perfect and undisturbed by the harsh realities that govern the lives of common folk." Eleanor had internalized these lessons well, perhaps too well. She found herself observing the family's habits and preferences with an attention to detail that bordered on intimate knowledge. She knew that his lordship preferred his morning tea at precisely 7 o'clock, that her ladyship suffered from headaches that required her rooms to be kept dim in the afternoons, and that the young master had a tendency toward melancholy that manifested in long walks through the estate gardens during the early evening hours. It was during one such evening that Eleanor first encountered Alexander Hartwell, the current Earl of Blackwood, in circumstances that shattered the carefully maintained barriers between their worlds. She had been returning from the village after posting a letter to her mother when she heard the sound of sobbing coming from the estate's private chapel. Curiosity overcoming caution, she had approached the small stone building to discover his lordship kneeling before the altar, his shoulders shaking with grief. Alexander Hartwell was 30 years old, having inherited his title and the crushing responsibilities that accompanied it at the tender age of 25. The burden of maintaining one of England's great estates, managing the welfare of hundreds of tenants, and upholding the family's reputation in society had aged him beyond his years. His dark hair showed premature threads of silver, and his blue eyes, which society ladies proclaimed devastatingly handsome, often held shadows that spoke of burdens no amount of wealth could ease. The death of his younger brother William in the Peninsular Wars had shattered something fundamental in Alexander's soul. William had been everything Alexander was not: carefree, optimistic, beloved by all who knew him. His loss had left a void that no amount of duty or noble responsibility could fill. On this particular evening, the anniversary of William's death, Alexander had sought solace in the chapel where he and his brother had once played as children, where their mother had taught them to pray, where the weight of his title felt momentarily lighter in the presence of something greater than earthly concerns. Eleanor had intended to retreat quietly, to pretend she had seen nothing of her master's private grief. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on the uneven stone step, and she stumbled, her cry of surprise echoing through the sacred space. Alexander looked up, his tear-stained face registering first surprise, then embarrassment, then something Eleanor could not quite identify. "Forgive me, your lordship," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the chapel's hushed atmosphere. "I did not mean to intrude upon your privacy. I shall leave immediately." But Alexander did not dismiss her. Instead, he studied her face in the candlelight, noting the genuine compassion in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, the obvious refinement in her speech that suggested education beyond what most servants received. "What is your name?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Eleanor Whitmore, your lordship. I am one of the housemaids." For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the vast chasm of social difference that separated them. In that moment, Alexander saw not a servant but a young woman whose eyes held depths of understanding that the ladies of his social circle, for all their breeding and accomplishments, had never demonstrated. And Eleanor saw not the remote, intimidating figure of her master, but a man struggling with grief and loneliness that mirrored her own hidden sorrows. "You need not leave," Alexander said finally. Sometimes grief shared is grief lessened." It was a statement that violated every rule of proper conduct, every boundary that governed the relationship between master and servant. Yet something in his voice, a vulnerability that his noble bearing usually concealed, kept Eleanor rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her instinct for compassion overriding her training in deference. "I lost my father last year, your lordship," she said softly. "The grief, it comes in waves, does it not? Just when you think you have mastered it, it rises again like a tide." Alexander nodded, surprised by the eloquence of her words, by the way she had captured exactly what he had been unable to express to his sophisticated friends and relatives. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition that transcended the artificial barriers of class and station. In the weeks following their encounter in the chapel, Eleanor found herself assigned to duties that brought her increasingly into contact with his lordship. Whether by design or coincidence, she could not say, but she began to suspect that Mrs. Pemberton had received instructions to place her in positions where their paths would cross. She was assigned to tend the library fires in the mornings when Alexander typically reviewed estate business, to polish the silver in the dining room during his afternoon correspondence, and to arrange flowers in the grand salon where he often received visitors. During these encounters, they maintained the proper formalities of master and servant. Alexander would acknowledge her presence with a slight nod, while Eleanor would curtsy and attend to her duties with downcast eyes. Yet beneath this surface propriety, an electric undercurrent of awareness pulsed between them. Eleanor became acutely conscious of his presence, the way his tall frame moved through the rooms with unconscious grace, the way his hands gestured when he spoke, the furrow that appeared between his brows when he concentrated on particularly difficult correspondence. Alexander, for his part, found himself anticipating Eleanor's appearances with an eagerness that both disturbed and intrigued him. He began to notice details about her that no proper gentleman should observe about a servant, the way sunlight caught auburn highlights in her carefully controlled hair, the unconscious elegance of her movements as she went about her tasks, the musical quality of her voice on the rare occasions when she spoke. The turning point came during a particularly difficult evening when Alexander received news that one of his tenant families had lost their home to fire. The responsibility of their welfare weighed heavily upon him, and he found himself walking the estate grounds in the late evening, seeking solace in the familiar paths of his childhood. It was near the rose garden that he encountered Eleanor, who had been gathering herbs for the kitchen under the cover of darkness. "Your lordship," she said, starting at his sudden appearance. "I apologize. I did not expect anyone to be about at this hour." "Nor did I," Alexander replied, noting how the moonlight transformed her humble appearance into something almost ethereal. "What brings you to the gardens so late?" "Cook requested chamomile for her ladyship's tea," Eleanor explained, holding up her small basket. "The night blooms are said to be more potent for soothing nerves." Alexander smiled at this bit of domestic wisdom, finding himself charmed by her practical knowledge. "And what do you recommend for soothing a troubled conscience?" The question was more intimate than propriety allowed, but the darkness seemed to create a space apart from the rigid rules that governed their daylight interactions. Eleanor considered her response carefully, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground. "My mother used to say that a troubled conscience is often a sign of a good heart, your lordship. Those who feel deeply the weight of their responsibilities are usually those best suited to bear them." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was lady's maid to the Duchess of Marlborough before she married my father," Eleanor said, then immediately regretted revealing so much about her family's circumstances. "Ah," Alexander said, understanding suddenly why Eleanor possessed such refinement despite her current station. "That explains much about your manner of speaking, your bearing." They walked in silence for a moment, the gravel path crunching softly beneath their feet. The estate gardens, meticulously maintained during the day, took on an otherworldly quality in the moonlight, with shadows creating secret alcoves and hidden retreats among the carefully pruned hedges and marble statuary. "May I ask what troubles your conscience this evening?" Eleanor ventured, her natural compassion overcoming her sense of proper boundaries. Alexander found himself telling her about the tenant family, about his struggles to balance the estate's financial needs with his moral obligation to care for those dependent upon him, about the loneliness of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives with no one to share the burden of responsibility. Eleanor listened without judgment, offering occasional words of encouragement that revealed an understanding of noble duty that surprised him with its depth and insight. "You speak as though you have experience with such matters," Alexander observed. "I have seen how difficult it is for those in positions of authority to make the right choices," Eleanor replied carefully. "The Duchess often struggled with similar decisions, and my mother would speak of the weight she carried in trying to do right by all those who depended upon her." Their conversation continued as they walked deeper into the garden, past the formal parterres and geometric hedges toward the wilder sections where nature was allowed to assert itself more freely. Here, among the climbing roses and night-blooming jasmine, the atmosphere became more intimate, the scents more intoxicating. It was Eleanor who first noticed that they had strayed far from the main paths, that they were now in a secluded corner of the garden where ancient oaks created a canopy that filtered the moonlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The realization should have sent her fleeing back to the servants' quarters, but something in the magic of the evening, in the unprecedented intimacy of their conversation, held her spellbound. "We should return," she said softly, but made no move to leave. "Yes," Alexander agreed, yet he too remained where he was, studying her face in the silver light. "Eleanor," he said, using her name for the first time, "do you ever feel as though you are living someone else's life? As though the person you truly are exists only in stolen moments like these?" The question struck her like a physical blow, so perfectly did it capture her own sense of displacement. "Every day, your lordship," she whispered. "Alexander," he said quietly. Here, in this moment, just Alexander. The use of his given name created an intimacy that transcended their difference in station, that transformed them from master and servant into simply a man and woman sharing a moment of profound connection beneath the stars. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a dangerous warmth that she recognized as the beginning of feelings that could only lead to ruin. "We must not," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Must not what?" Alexander asked, stepping closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Must not pretend that this moment could lead to anything but heartbreak and scandal," she replied, even as she made no move to retreat. Alexander raised his hand as though to touch her face, then stopped himself, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek. "Perhaps heartbreak and scandal are prices worth paying for one moment of genuine connection in a world full of artificial pleasantries and calculated affections." The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility and danger, with the terrible beauty of a love that could never be acknowledged, never be pursued, never be anything more than this single, perfect, impossible moment under the stars. 3 months passed in a delicate dance of stolen glances and carefully orchestrated encounters. Alexander found excuses to review household matters that required his presence in areas where Eleanor worked, while she discovered reasons to linger in rooms where he might appear. Their conversations, when they occurred, remained on the surface proper and deferential, yet beneath the formal words lay currents of longing and connection that grew stronger with each passing day. The estate's social calendar reached its pinnacle with the announcement of the Midsummer Ball, an annual celebration that drew the cream of English society to Ravens Hollow. For weeks, the household bustled with preparations as guest rooms were aired and polished, the ballroom floor refinished to mirror perfection, and the kitchens transformed into workshops of culinary artistry. Eleanor found herself pressed into service helping the ladies' maids prepare elaborate gowns, her nimble fingers proving particularly skilled at the delicate work of attaching pearls and securing intricate hairstyles. Lady Catherine Blackwood, Alexander's mother, supervised these preparations with the keen eye of a general marshalling troops for battle. A woman of 62 who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of high society for 4 decades, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect any deviation from perfection in the arrangements for social occasions. Her approval was sought by hostesses throughout London, and an invitation to one of her gatherings was considered a mark of supreme social distinction. "This year's ball must surpass all previous efforts," Lady Catherine declared during one of her morning inspections of the household preparations. "There are rumors that the Duke of Wellington himself may attend, and I will not have it said that Ravens Hollow failed to provide hospitality worthy of England's greatest military hero." The arrival of guests began 3 days before the ball, as was customary for such grand occasions. Carriages bearing coats of arms from across the realm pulled up the circular drive, disgorging elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen who greeted each other with the elaborate courtesies of their class. The house filled with the rustle of silk, the glitter of jewels, and the musical laughter of those born to privilege and leisure. Among the guests was Lady Beatrice Pemberton, the housekeeper's distant cousin and a young woman of impeccable breeding whom Lady Catherine had marked as a suitable bride for her son. At 25, Beatrice possessed all the qualities deemed essential in a future countess: beauty that had been carefully cultivated through proper diet and exercise, accomplishments in music and languages that demonstrated her superior education, and most importantly, a dowry substantial enough to ease the financial pressures that even great estates sometimes faced. Eleanor observed these arrivals from the shadows of her service, her heart growing heavier with each new reminder of the vast gulf that separated her world from Alexander's. She watched as he greeted his guests with the perfect manners of his breeding, noting how effortlessly he moved among people of his own class, how naturally he fit into a world where conversation sparkled with wit and cultural references she could only half understand. The evening of the ball arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed ordered specifically for aristocratic celebrations. As sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, carriages continued to arrive bearing guests in increasingly elaborate finery. The ladies descended from their conveyances like exotic birds, their gowns created from silk and satin in jewel tones, their hair arranged in fantastic constructions adorned with feathers, flowers, and precious stones. Eleanor's duties that evening kept her constantly moving between the servants' areas and the main floors of the house. She helped arrange last-minute details for the ladies' toilettes, carried messages between the kitchen and the butler, and ensured that the seemingly endless supply of champagne and delicacies flowed smoothly to the guests. From the gallery above the ballroom, she caught glimpses of the splendor below, hundreds of candles reflecting off crystal chandeliers, the swirl of silk gowns as couples moved through elaborate country dances, the flash of jewels as ladies curtsied to their partners. It was nearly midnight when disaster struck in the form of a clumsy footman who collided with Eleanor as she carried a tray of crystal glasses down a back staircase. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the servants' corridors, and Eleanor found herself kneeling among the shards, her dress soaked with champagne and her right hand bleeding from a deep cut across her palm. Mrs. Pemberton appeared within moments, her face a mask of professional calm despite the crisis. "Jameson, clean this mess immediately," she ordered the footman before turning to Eleanor. "You cannot serve in that condition. Go to your room and tend to that wound properly." As Eleanor made her way through the back corridors toward the servants' stairs, she became disoriented in her pain and distress, taking a wrong turn that led her into the main section of the house. She found herself in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic plants and flowers that served as a quiet retreat from the ballroom's festivities. Moonlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns of silver and shadow among the greenery. She was attempting to bind her wounded hand with her apron when she heard footsteps on the marble floor. Looking up, she saw Alexander approaching, his formal evening wear making him appear more devastatingly handsome than she had ever seen him. His white waistcoat and black tailcoat fit his tall frame to perfection, while his cravat was tied in the intricate style favored by the most fashionable gentlemen of the ton. "Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with concern as he noticed her distress. "What has happened?" "A small accident, your lordship," she replied, struggling to rise from where she had sunk onto a marble bench. "I shall return to my quarters immediately." But Alexander was already moving toward her, his eyes fixed on the blood seeping through her makeshift bandage. "Let me see," he said, reaching for her injured hand with a gentleness that made her heart race. "Please, your lordship, you must return to your guests. Lady Beatrice will wonder where you have gone." At the mention of the lady his mother had chosen for him, Alexander's expression darkened. "Let them wonder," he said with an edge to his voice that Eleanor had never heard before. "I am tired of playing the dutiful son, the perfect earl, the willing participant in arrangements made for me by others." He had taken her wounded hand in both of his own, examining the cut with the practiced eye of someone who had tended to injured tenants and estate workers. "This needs proper cleaning and bandaging," he murmured, then looked up to meet her eyes. "There is a small sitting room nearby with medical supplies. Will you allow me to tend to it?" Eleanor knew she should refuse, should insist on returning to her quarters despite the pain. But the tenderness in his touch, the genuine concern in his voice, weakened her resolve. "If your lordship insists," she whispered, The sitting room was indeed small and intimate, lit only by the fire burning in the grate and a few candles on the mantelpiece. Alexander guided Eleanor to a chair near the firelight, then knelt beside her to cleanse and bandage her wound. His touch was infinitely gentle, his fingers warm against her skin as he worked with careful precision. "You have done this before," Eleanor observed, trying to focus on anything other than the intimacy of his ministrations. "William and I were always injuring ourselves as children," Alexander replied, his voice soft with memory. "Our mother despaired of keeping us presentable for formal occasions. I learned to tend cuts and scrapes out of necessity." As he secured the bandage, his fingers lingered on her wrist, tracing patterns on her skin that sent fire racing through her veins. When he looked up, their faces were only inches apart, and Eleanor could see her own longing reflected in his eyes. "Alexander," she whispered, forgetting propriety in the intensity of the moment. "Eleanor," he breathed, his hand moving to cup her face with infinite tenderness. "God help me, but I cannot stop thinking about you. You haunt my dreams, my waking hours, every moment of every day." "This is madness," she replied, even as she leaned into his touch. "We cannot, it would mean ruin for both of us." "Then let us be ruined together," Alexander said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "I would rather face scandal with you than spend a lifetime of respectability without you." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise, passionate as a storm, and tender as a prayer. All the weeks of suppressed longing, all the careful barriers they had constructed between them, crumbled in that moment of perfect connection. Eleanor felt herself drowning in sensation, in the taste of champagne on his lips, the scent of sandalwood that clung to his skin, the strength of his arms as they drew her closer. Time seemed suspended as they explored this new territory of touch and intimacy, their careful world of master and servant dissolving into something far more primal and true. Alexander's hands tangled in her hair, loosening the severe bun until her chestnut waves fell around her shoulders like silk. Eleanor's fingers traced the strong line of his jaw, marveling at the reality of touching him, of being held by him, of feeling his heart beating against her own. It was the distant sound of music from the ballroom that finally broke the spell, reminding them both of the world that lay beyond this magical interlude. They separated slowly, reluctantly, their breathing ragged and their eyes wide with the magnitude of what had just occurred between them. "I must go," Eleanor whispered, though every fiber of her being rebelled against the necessity. "Not yet," Alexander pleaded, his voice rough with emotion. "Please, not yet." But Eleanor had already risen from the chair, her practical nature reasserting itself despite the chaos in her heart. "Your guests will miss you, your lordship. Lady Beatrice will expect your attention." "Damn Lady Beatrice," Alexander said with sudden vehemence. "Damn them all. What has happened between us tonight? It changes everything." Eleanor looked at him with eyes that held both infinite love and infinite sadness. "No, Alexander," she said softly. "It changes nothing. You are still the Earl of Blackwood, and I am still a servant in your house. What happened here was beautiful and impossible and can never happen again." Before he could respond, she was gone, fleeing through the servants' passages like Cinderella escaping before midnight, leaving Alexander alone in the firelight with the taste of her kiss still burning on his lips and the certain knowledge that his life had been irrevocably altered by one perfect, impossible night. The weeks following the midsummer ball passed in a haze of barely suppressed tension and careful avoidance. Eleanor threw herself into her duties with renewed vigor, accepting extra assignments that kept her in the furthest reaches of the estate, away from areas where she might encounter Alexander. When their paths inevitably crossed, she maintained such perfect deference that no observer could have detected any departure from proper servant behavior. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs, and her hands trembled with the memory of his touch. Alexander, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the facade of the dutiful earl his position demanded. He attended the social functions his mother arranged, made polite conversation with Lady Beatrice and other suitable young ladies, and conducted estate business with his usual efficiency. But those who knew him well noticed changes, a distraction during conversations, a tendency to stare out windows toward the servants' quarters, and an increasing impatience with the elaborate rituals of aristocratic courtship. Lady Catherine Blackwood was far too experienced in the ways of society to miss the subtle signs of her son's unrest. During their weekly private breakfast in her sitting room, she observed his listless picking at Mrs. Henderson's expertly prepared kedgeree and decided that direct intervention was required. "Alexander, darling," she began with the deceptively gentle tone she employed when preparing to deliver ultimatums, "I have been corresponding with Lady Beatrice's mother regarding certain arrangements we discussed earlier this season." Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What manner of arrangements, mother?" "Wedding arrangements, naturally. The Duke of Pemberton is eager to see his daughter settled, and I confess I am equally eager to see you properly married and establishing the next generation of the Blackwood line. I have suggested that an engagement announcement might be appropriate for the autumn, with a spring wedding to follow." The kedgeree fell from Alexander's fork with a soft plop as he stared at his mother. "You have suggested what?" "Really, Alexander, there is no need for theatrics. You have shown Lady Beatrice every proper attention this season. Her dowry is more than adequate to resolve certain financial pressures facing the estate, and her breeding is beyond reproach. The match has been understood by both families since her debut." "Understood by both families," Alexander repeated slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "And at what point was my understanding solicited in this matter?" Lady Catherine's spine stiffened at her son's tone. "Your understanding has always been assumed, as is appropriate for a gentleman of your position. Personal preference, while charming in poetry and novels, is a luxury that men of our station cannot indulge when the continuation of ancient bloodlines and the preservation of family wealth are at stake." Alexander rose from the table with such force that his chair overturned. "Cannot indulge? Mother, are you suggesting that I should marry a woman I do not love, spend my life with someone for whom I feel nothing but polite indifference, simply to satisfy the expectations of society? I am suggesting that you conduct yourself as your father did, and his father before him, and every Earl of Blackwood for the past 3 centuries, Lady Catherine replied sharply. "Love, as you call it, is a temporary madness that leads to ruin and scandal. Duty, respect, and shared values are the foundations upon which successful marriages are built. And if I refuse? If I choose to marry for love rather than convenience?" Lady Catherine's laugh was cold as winter morning. "Love? With whom, pray tell? Some vapid debutante who catches your fancy for a season? Some actress or opera singer who would drag our family name through the mud of public scandal? Or perhaps," and here her voice took on a tone of withering disdain, "you have formed some ridiculous attachment to someone even more inappropriate?" The way she spoke the last words, with a precision that suggested knowledge rather than speculation, sent ice through Alexander's veins. He studied his mother's face, noting the calculating gleam in her eyes that had served her so well in decades of social maneuvering. "What exactly are you implying, mother?" "I am implying nothing, Alexander. I am stating facts. You have been observed in conversation with certain members of the household staff. Conversations that, while perhaps innocent in intention, could be misconstrued by those who delight in spreading malicious gossip. Eleanor. She knew about Eleanor." Alexander felt the walls of his privileged world closing in around him like the bars of an elegant cage. "I am always courteous to the servants. It is a mark of good breeding to treat those in our employ with basic human decency." Human decency, yes. Private tête-à-têtes in conservatories and gardens, no. Lady Catherine's words fell like sword strokes. "Really, Alexander, did you think such indiscretions could escape notice? There are no secrets in a household, only varying degrees of discretion among the staff." The blood drained from Alexander's face as he realized the full implications of her words. If his mother knew, if the servants gossiped, then Eleanor's reputation was in danger along with his own. The rules that governed relationships between masters and servants were harsh and unforgiving, with the burden of blame always falling upon the subordinate party. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want you to remember who you are and what you owe to our family name," Lady Catherine replied. "I want you to announce your engagement to Lady Beatrice at the Michaelmas ball, marry her in the spring as befits your station, and put aside these romantic fantasies that threaten everything our ancestors have built." "And if I do not?" Lady Catherine smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Then I will be forced to take steps to protect our family's reputation." Steps that would be unfortunate for certain members of our household staff who have forgotten their proper place. The threat was clear and devastating. Alexander understood that his mother possessed both the will and the power to destroy Eleanor's life with a few well-placed words. A dismissed servant without references faced poverty, prostitution, or starvation as the only alternatives to destitution. The protection he might offer her as her lover would come at the cost of complete social exile for both of them. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the estate, Alexander walked the grounds in torment, wrestling with choices that offered no hope of happiness regardless of the path he chose. To marry Lady Beatrice would mean a lifetime of emotional emptiness, but it would protect Eleanor from his mother's vengeance. To refuse would mean exposing the woman he loved to consequences he could not bear to contemplate. It was near the chapel where they had first truly encountered each other that he found Eleanor waiting in the shadows, her face pale but determined in the lamplight from a nearby window. "I know," she said simply before he could speak. "Mrs. Pemberton felt it necessary to inform me of certain conversations regarding my conduct." "Eleanor," Alexander began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Please, let me speak while I still have the courage," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that gleamed in her eyes. "What happened between us was the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced, but it was also the most selfish. I allowed my feelings to overcome my duty, my good sense, my knowledge of what such behavior could cost both of us." "You did nothing wrong," Alexander said fiercely. "The fault is mine for allowing my desires to place you in danger." "The fault belongs to neither of us," Eleanor replied. "The fault belongs to a world that makes love a crime when it crosses certain invisible lines. But we cannot change the world, Alexander. We can only choose how to live within it." "I will not marry Lady Beatrice," Alexander declared. "I will not sacrifice our happiness to preserve the facade of a system I have come to despise." Eleanor's smile was infinitely sad and infinitely loving. "Yes, you will," she said softly. "Because you are a good man who understands that your personal happiness cannot be purchased at the price of destroying others. Your tenants depend upon you, your estate provides employment for hundreds of families, your marriage to Lady Beatrice will secure the financial foundation that ensures their continued welfare. And what of you? What of your happiness?" "I will survive," Eleanor said with the quiet strength that had first drawn him to her. "I have a proposal that will solve both our dilemmas, but you must hear me out completely before you respond." She reached into her apron and withdrew a letter, its seal already broken. "My aunt in Yorkshire has written to offer me a position in her household. It is a respectable situation with a family of modest means but good reputation. If I accept, I will leave Ravens Hollow tomorrow and never return." "No," Alexander said immediately. "I forbid it." "You cannot forbid what you have no right to command," Eleanor replied gently. "And this is the only way, my love. If I remain, your mother will find reasons to dismiss me in disgrace. If I leave voluntarily, I can preserve my reputation and begin again elsewhere. You can fulfill your obligations to your family and your station without the constant reminder of what might have been." The logic of her proposal was unassailable, and its very reasonableness made it more devastating than any emotional appeal could have been. Alexander saw his future stretching before him like a magnificently appointed prison, decades of appropriate behavior, suitable children raised by nurses and tutors, social obligations performed with perfect grace, and at the center of it all, the hollow ache of a love denied. "I will never forget you," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Nor I you," Eleanor replied, reaching up to touch his face one final time. "But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps having known perfect love, even briefly, is more than most people are given in an entire lifetime." Their final kiss was gentle and desperate, a seal upon a love that would remain forever perfect because it would remain forever unfulfilled. As Eleanor slipped away into the darkness, Alexander stood alone beneath the storm clouds, feeling the first drops of rain against his face like tears from heaven itself. 5 years passed like seasons changing over the estate's ancient grounds, each marked by the rhythms of aristocratic life that had governed Ravens Hollow for generations. Alexander married Lady Beatrice in a ceremony that was pronounced by all of society to be magnificent, with the bride's silk gown and family jewels providing exactly the sort of spectacle that reinforced the stability and continuity of England's great houses. The marriage produced the required heir within 2 years, a son christened William Alexander Hartwell in honor of his deceased uncle, and a daughter followed 2 years later, ensuring the succession that had been Lady Catherine's primary concern. To external observers, the Earl and Countess of Blackwood represented everything admirable about their class: beauty, breeding, wealth, and the sort of mutual respect that society deemed more valuable than the passionate love celebrated in romantic poetry. They performed their public duties with grace, hosted magnificent entertainments, and managed their vast holdings with the efficiency that marked successful aristocratic marriages. Alexander proved himself an exemplary landlord, implementing agricultural improvements that increased both productivity and tenant welfare, while Beatrice established herself as a leader in charitable endeavors that brought credit to the family name. Yet those closest to the family noticed subtle signs that all was not entirely as it appeared in this picture of domestic harmony. Alexander spent increasing amounts of time traveling to the estate's distant holdings, often remaining away for weeks at a time on business that seemed to require his personal attention. When at home, he was courteous to his wife but distant, treating her with the sort of careful respect one might show to a valued business partner rather than a beloved companion. Beatrice, for her part, seemed content with the arrangement, having entered marriage with realistic expectations about aristocratic unions and finding satisfaction in her children, her social position, and her various charitable works. Lady Catherine, now in her late 60s but still formidable in her management of family affairs, maintained careful watch over the household's reputation while beginning to transfer certain responsibilities to her daughter-in-law. The transition was not entirely smooth, as Beatrice possessed her own strong opinions about household management and social obligations, but the two women reached an accommodation that preserved family harmony while allowing each to exercise authority in her preferred spheres. The estate itself flourished under Alexander's stewardship, with new cottages built for tenant families, modern farming techniques introduced to increase crop yields, and a school established in the village to provide basic education for the children of working families. These improvements enhanced both the property's value and its reputation as a model of enlightened estate management, bringing visitors from across England to study Alexander's methods. It was during one such visit, when a delegation of Scottish landowners had come to examine the estate's innovative crop rotation system, that Alexander received news that would shatter the careful equilibrium he had constructed around his life. Mrs. Pemberton, now elderly but still sharp in her attention to household matters, approached him with unusual hesitation during his morning review of estate business. "Your lordship," she said, her voice carrying a weight that immediately drew his attention, "I have received correspondence from Yorkshire that I felt you should be made aware of immediately." Alexander's hand froze over the ledger he had been reviewing. In 5 years, Mrs. Pemberton had never mentioned anything relating to Eleanor's departure or subsequent circumstances, maintaining the discreet silence that made her invaluable in her position. Her decision to break that silence now could only mean something of exceptional importance. "What manner of correspondence?" he asked quietly. "News of Miss Whitmore's circumstances, your lordship." I fear the news is not good." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. In the 5 years since Eleanor's departure, he had maintained strict discipline in not seeking information about her new life, believing that knowledge would only make his own situation more unbearable. He had buried himself in duty and responsibility, telling himself that ignorance was kinder than the torment of knowing details about a happiness he could not share. "Tell me," he said simply. Mrs. Pemberton's usually composed features showed genuine distress. "Miss Whitmore's aunt passed away suddenly last winter, your lordship. The family she was serving, there were financial difficulties, and they could no longer afford to maintain full staff. Miss Whitmore found herself without employment and with very limited resources." Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. "Where is she now?" "That is the difficult part, your lordship. She attempted to secure another position, but without recent references from a household of standing, the opportunities were limited. My correspondent believes she may have been forced to seek employment in London, in circumstances that may not be suitable for a young woman of her character." The implications of Mrs. Pemberton's carefully chosen words were devastating. Alexander understood all too well what limited options were available to unemployed young women in London, especially those without family support or financial resources. The fate that Eleanor might have suffered because of their love, because of his inability to protect her from the consequences of their connection, filled him with a rage and despair that threatened to consume him entirely. "Do you have any specific information about her current whereabouts?" Alexander asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Only an address in Whitechapel, your lordship. I took the liberty of writing to the local parish, but the area is not one where young ladies typically maintain regular correspondence." Whitechapel. Even Alexander, sheltered as he was by wealth and privilege, knew that neighborhood's reputation as one of London's most desperate quarters, where poverty and vice flourished in the shadows of industrial prosperity. The thought of Eleanor in such surroundings, subjected to the degradations that circumstances might force upon her, was unbearable. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Alexander made a decision based entirely on his own desires rather than the expectations of duty and propriety. He ordered his fastest horse saddled and rode through the darkness toward London, carrying with him enough gold to resolve whatever crisis had befallen the woman he had never stopped loving. London's East End assaulted his senses with its cacophony of sounds, stenches, and sights that seemed designed to assault anyone accustomed to the refined environments of Mayfair and country estates. Narrow streets teemed with humanity in various stages of desperation, while gin shops and bawdy houses advertised their wares with blatant disregard for public decency. Alexander made his way through this urban jungle with growing dread, fearing what he might discover when he finally located Eleanor. The address Mrs. Pemberton had provided led him to a boarding house that managed to be both squalid and expensive, catering to those who had fallen from better circumstances but retained enough pride to avoid the workhouse. The landlady, a woman whose painted face and elaborate dress suggested familiarity with London's seamier entertainments, examined Alexander's obvious wealth with calculating eyes. "Eleanor Whitmore," she repeated when he inquired. "Oh yes, poor dear. Lovely girl, educated too, but circumstances, well, circumstances can be cruel to ladies without protection, if you understand my meaning." Alexander's hands clenched at his sides. "Where is she now?" "Upstairs, room 7. But I should warn you, sir, she's been quite ill. Consumption, the doctor thinks, though between you and me, I believe it's more a matter of a broken heart than diseased lungs. She speaks in her sleep sometimes, calls out for someone named Alexander." The narrow staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward as Alexander climbed toward the room that contained either his salvation or his damnation. His heart hammered against his ribs as he raised his hand to knock on the scarred wooden door, unsure whether he had come as rescuer or destroyer, whether his presence would bring healing or further harm to the woman he loved. The voice that answered his knock was Eleanor's, but changed by illness and suffering into something barely recognizable. When the door opened and she saw him standing in the dim hallway, her eyes widened with shock, disbelief, and a joy so profound it illuminated her pale features like sunrise. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "This must be a dream. You cannot be real." "I am real," he said, drinking in the sight of her face despite the changes wrought by hardship and illness. She was thinner than he remembered, her clothes mended and patched, but her eyes still held the intelligence and compassion that had first captured his heart. "And I have come to take you home." "Home?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no bitterness in the sound, only weary acceptance. "I have no home, Alexander. I have nothing left to offer you but a scandal that would destroy everything you have built in these 5 years." "Then let it be destroyed," Alexander said fiercely, stepping into the small room and taking her hands in his. "I have spent 5 years being the perfect earl, the dutiful husband, the responsible landowner, and I have been miserable every moment of it. I will not lose you again to propriety and social expectations." Eleanor searched his face, seeing the changes that 5 years of unfulfilled duty had wrought. He was older, more weathered by responsibility, but his eyes still held the same depth of feeling that had first drawn her to him. "What of your wife? Your children? Your position in society?" "Beatrice and I have an understanding," Alexander said. "Our marriage has given her the security and status she desired, and she has given me the heirs that society demanded. She may even be relieved to be freed from the pretense of affection between us. As for society..." He shrugged with elegant dismissal. "Society can adjust its expectations or find someone else to disapprove of." "The scandal would follow us everywhere," Eleanor warned, though her resistance was weakening with each word he spoke. Then we will go somewhere that scandal cannot reach, Alexander replied. America, perhaps, or Australia. Somewhere we can be simply Alexander and Eleanor, without titles, or expectations, or the weight of ancient names. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine such a possibility, a life where love mattered more than bloodline, where character counted more than wealth, where they could build something true and lasting together. Then practical concerns reasserted themselves. I am ill, Alexander. I may not have many years left, and those years would be marked by the knowledge that our happiness had been purchased at the cost of your children's future, your estate's welfare, your family's honor. Alexander silenced her with a kiss that tasted of desperate hope and 5 years of accumulated longing. When they finally separated, his forehead rested against hers as he spoke words that would reshape both their destinies. Then whatever years we will have them together, he said. I have learned that a life without love is no life at all, that duty without joy is merely elegant slavery. If God has given us this second chance, I will not waste it on the altar of other people's expectations. In the weeks that followed, London society buzzed with whispers about the Earl of Blackwood's shocking abandonment of his responsibilities. Some spoke of temporary madness brought on by the pressures of estate management, while others suggested that scandalous influences had corrupted a previously exemplary nobleman. Lady Catherine took to her bed with nervous complaints, while Beatrice met the crisis with the practical efficiency that had always characterized her approach to life. I assume you have made adequate financial provisions for the children's future, was her only comment when Alexander informed her of his decision to seek a divorce and leave England permanently. More than adequate, Alexander assured her. The estate is entailed and will pass to William regardless of my personal circumstances. I have established trust funds that will provide both children with substantial incomes for life, and you will continue to enjoy the use of the London house and your jointure as specified in our marriage settlement. Beatrice nodded with satisfaction. Then I see no reason why this arrangement should not prove satisfactory to all parties. I confess, Alexander, that I have always known your heart was engaged elsewhere. Perhaps now we can all find the happiness that has proven so elusive within the constraints of conventional marriage. The Earl and Countess of Blackwood were divorced by Act of Parliament 6 months later, a process that required substantial financial expenditure but proved surprisingly achievable given Beatrice's cooperation and the discreet influence of several sympathetic peers who had themselves chafed under society's rigid expectations. Alexander formally renounced his title in favor of his infant son, accepting exile from English society as the price of personal happiness. On a crisp October morning, as golden leaves danced across the estate grounds he would never see again, Alexander helped Eleanor into the carriage that would carry them to Portsmouth and the ship that would take them to New York. She had recovered much of her strength during the months of preparation for their departure, as though the prospect of genuine happiness had rekindled her will to live. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked as the carriage pulled away from Ravenshollow for the final time. Giving up everything you were born to for an uncertain future with me? Alexander smiled, the first genuinely happy expression his features had worn in 5 years. I regret nothing except the time we lost to other people's definitions of honor and duty, he said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. We have the rest of our lives to discover what we might build together, and I can imagine no greater adventure. Behind them, the great estate settled into its new rhythms under the guidance of capable stewards and trustees who would preserve it for the young heir who would one day inherit not just wealth and position, but the knowledge that true love sometimes requires the courage to sacrifice everything else the world considers valuable. And in the servants' quarters of Ravenshollow, Mrs. Pemberton allowed herself a small smile as she filed away the final correspondence regarding the matter. Some stories, she reflected, deserved endings worthy of their beginnings, regardless of what conventional wisdom might dictate about the proper order of things. Eleanor and Alexander sailed into their future together, carrying with them nothing but love and the unshakable conviction that a life lived authentically, however challenging, was infinitely preferable to a lifetime of elegant compromise. Their love had indeed changed everything, not through the dramatic gestures beloved by romantic literature, but through the quiet courage required to choose happiness over expectation, truth over convenience, and each other over the glittering prison of aristocratic duty. In choosing love, they had found not just each other, but themselves, and in that discovery lay the true revolution that would echo through generations yet to come.